All right. Good afternoon. Actually, Jim, could we go back to the cover page? Thank you. My name is Adam Bernard, president of the SAA and founder of Auto Perspectives. Thank you all for joining us today for which should be a very insightful webinar from our friends at Ipsos as they discuss their ninth annual Ipsos Global Trends Report, The Uneasy Decade. And that certainly sounds foreboding. Next slide. We always like to start our events by, excuse me, explaining a little about the SAA for those of you who may be new, excuse me, for those of you who may be new to us. Here you see our value proposition, which lays out what we hope to achieve. Our core value focuses on providing relevant events, access to industry leaders, and of course, great networking. We do have a very diverse membership representing OEMs, suppliers, data providers, and whoever is looking for timely, relevant industry information. And thank you to those of you who have become or been members. Critical to our success are our corporate partners. I want to thank all of our sponsors for their support, which has allowed us to evolve and provide greater value to our members and to the industry as a whole. Sponsorship of the SAA is cost effective and provides some unique and targeted ways to reach a variety of decision makers in the auto industry. Please contact me or anyone with SAA if you'd like additional information or if you have ideas or suggestions for SAA events or topics we should cover. Please mark your calendars for our upcoming events. On March 11th, the experts from Plant Moran will host a brief discussion on how automotive suppliers are rethinking product and operational innovation to stay competitive amid ongoing cost pressures. They will share where innovation is creating value today and what it means for supplier strategy. Coffee breaks are free to attend and only 15 minutes long, but provide some amazing content in that short period of time. Then on April 28th, the SAA and our partners from Stout will host the 13th annual Automotive Recall Summit at the Hyatt House in Royal Oak. That'll be followed on May 19th with the 17th annual Purchasing Summit at Morelli in Southfield. This event, which is held with our automakers partners, Plant Moran and Mima Original Equipment, features purchasing executives from the leading automakers. Watch your email for information on both summits as registration will open soon. And of course, please check the SAA website regularly to see the latest on all our events. You can also scan the QR code here, which will take you directly to the website. Before I turn over today's program to Graham and Jennifer, I'd like to remind you that they will try to take as many questions as possible after Jennifer's remarks. Please submit your questions by entering them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. I'd now like to welcome today's speakers. Graham Gordon, who will moderate today's call, is a director at Ipsos. Jennifer Bender, who will present findings from the Trends Report, is an associate partner with Ipsos Strategy 3, which operates in the market, brand, and innovation strategy advisory fields. Thanks for joining us today, and take it away.
All right. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. We're certainly happy to be with all of you today and very excited to share with you some insights from our latest study. And certainly, as mentioned, we'll have lots of time at the end for any questions that you have, and are looking forward to hearing what kind of things resonate with you. I'll share my screen and certainly hope that this is going to feel very relevant and timely. Some of you may have seen some of the release when we came out with this study a couple of months ago. It's been updated and really curated for the auto industry. So we'll be really focusing on what the implications are for the automotive industry and really focusing in on the US in particular. So you'll see some references to our global study. We always think that that is important in terms of putting into context what we're seeing in the US. So just know that there's lots more that you can dive into above and beyond what we'll show you today. So the important thing to know about this study as well is that we have been running global trends for more than a decade now, and it's really a passion project of mine and of all of the team who works on this, and something that we're very proud of, but really something that is rooted in this deep consumer understanding of knowing how consumer attitudes and values and trends have been evolving over a long time. So you'll see reference in the results here today that harken back to some of our original questions way back when, more than 10 years ago, and certainly some continuity from other reports that we've done over the past 10 years. But we think what's really important is to also look at not just how consumers are feeling, but also to take a step back and think about the broader context of what's happening in the world. How are consumers responding to that? And how is that shaping our category? And how is that shaping expectations as well? And I think the important thing to know is that the core attitudes and values study is a big part of the trends in terms of how we define them and how we share them with you. But it's also part of what we're thinking about in terms of understanding change at multiple levels. And this is really about looking at all the things that are happening in the world, from bigger macro forces like economic change, technological change, all the way down to little signals, things that we're seeing bubbling up in culture, in social media, new behaviors that we're starting to see emerge, and putting all of that together, combined with the shifts that we're seeing from our study in terms of how people are responding, how markets are responding, and triangulating what we see as change and developing the trends out of that. So I think that's important to know as well, because it's an amazing resource for you to be able to leverage, that is not just the trends that we'll talk about in depth today, but there are these bigger forces that are happening in the world around consumers that are impacting how they feel about, confidence in the economy, how they're thinking about brands, how they're thinking about defining success. So there are lots of things that we look into that we won't go into detail today, but I think another resource that you have access to that we're happy to take offline with anyone who wants to dive in further are these bigger macro forces, things that are shaping consumer behavior and expectations. So just know that those are some things that we can go deeper into if anyone is interested in it as a follow-up. But I think the other piece of it is, looking at some of those macro forces and developing a perspective. And four of the things that we've seen that we think are really driving consumer behavior this year in 2026. Number one, we mentioned it at the top about an uneasy decade, that there's so much disruption happening, from changing world order, the kind of questioning of the US's role on the global stage, to things like economic uncertainty. There's a lot of uneasiness and a lot of uncertainty happening in the world around consumers that certainly has an impact on how they're feeling. I think the second big force that we see in those macro forces that is really driving change is generational change. So we see in the news a lot of discussion about Gen Alpha and Gen Z and what are they going to need as they're coming into the category. But I think the bigger story is also about an aging population, in particular in the US. So thinking about understanding different age ranges, their different needs for our category, how that changes expectations as well is really important. Third, AI advances, it's everywhere. It's certainly something that is part of every category, even if it's not a technology client that we work with. And that is really about the wholesale transformation, about, everything from operational capabilities, but also concerns from the consumer perspective about, what is going to be the impact on everything from home energy costs to careers. And that's tied in a little bit with this notion of sustainability and the shift to what we call silent sustainability, where there's a bit of backlash. Certainly, we've seen on ESG, but there's also a reckoning and a realization that the systemic nature of sustainability and of climate change requires action from governments, from policymakers, from committed corporations as well, that it's not just consumers who need to act. So there's a little bit of fatigue that's happening there, and I think a realization of the systemic nature of climate change and ESG action. So all of this really goes into the mix in terms of setting the stage of what is the landscape around consumers. And that is part of what informs the development of the way that the trends are evolving. And so you may recognize these from last year's talk if you attended that one as well. And what we've done since last year is really look at how these trends are evolving. And these trends are meant to, have some staying power in the sense that they are designed to be, farther facing in terms of being able to depend on them for the next couple of years. So they don't necessarily change wholesale year over year, but they do evolve and they do start to morph. So we'll spend some time talking about how these have evolved over the past year and what the impact is on different brands as well as the automotive industry. So the first one is around globalization, and what we've seen change here is that certainly there's an impact of the Trump administration's goal of setting the global trade agenda, but it's not just about that. There's a long-standing shift in terms of perceptions of globalization, and at the same time that we've seen changeovers in power in the U.S., we've seen a lot of global elections, especially in the fall of 2024. And that really has meant a changing of the guard and, a sharpening of tensions as that changeover is happening. So a lot of citizens are starting to question in the US as well as elsewhere, starting to question, how connected should we be as markets and what are the kind of political ramifications of that? So it is about asserting primacy of one country over the other, but it's also about understanding the positive benefits of globalization as well. So what we see in the data is that, more than half of the consumers, almost two-thirds, are getting to the point where, they prefer to buy products from their country rather than products from abroad. And we think that this is really tied to the sense of national pride, of trust in local goods, but it also varies widely. So, this is a question that's asking about products in general. We're not necessarily asking about automotive or CPG. But I think it indicates what we're seeing in terms of people really starting to understand that their money does have an impact, that how they spend has an impact on the national stage and the international stage as well. At the same time, there's still more than half of consumers think that globalization is good for the country. So there's this recognition that while it's important to support local, and local, by the way, could be local in terms of your community, your state, your city. It doesn't always have to be national. There's this recognition that globalization is good for the country and that there is cultural value as well as economic value to the exchange of goods and ideas. But I think that we've seen over the past year a lot of brands really struggling to navigate this fracturing of globalization. I think one example is brands like Coca-Cola, who do have a very American image, are starting to dial that back carefully in other countries because of the concern about negative impact of an American brand. At the same time, I think there's, the flip side of that is a lot of pride in local, and we see that in things like the HO in Mexico movement. We certainly see that in terms of buying American brands. So it's a bit of a both sides of the coin in terms of dialing up and dialing down. Where do you lean in and where do you lean out? And what we think what does this mean for the market? Certainly things like international trade relations, tariffs have a huge impact on prices, but it also is having an impact on loyalty, brand loyalty, and sentiment about association with a particular country. And it doesn't always necessarily translate, which, I think is the interesting thing that we're seeing here, that, brands are not necessarily viewed in the same way in automotive as they are elsewhere. So it's really kind of a thought starter here in terms of the industry of how do you think about capitalizing on patriotic or nationalist sentiment without turning off other buyers? And what does that mean for innovation? Where can innovation or can technology and the services that you're offering, how can that potentially beat nationalism? So it's interesting to think about that kind of duality of, where people may feel kind of pulled in two directions. And that's really reflected in this thought around, what we're seeing in terms of consumers for certainly the politicization of more topics than ever before. But we also see examples of, how people are navigating that in creative ways. I think, Graham pointed out that Tesla is kind of a case study in how people are navigating that. But it really comes down to, how well do you navigate and understand your core constituent feelings on these hot button issues? And then realistically understanding as well, like, does it matter? Does it truly matter when people are coming to choose a vehicle, what your stance is on a particular issue or what your brand is associated with? So interesting kind of thought starter questions, and we'll go a little bit faster, but wanted to kind of signal what we had in terms of the depth of the report here. So the next one is around splintered societies, and I think this is really, certainly tied to the politicization and the globalization of the last trend, but it's really more honing in on what are all of the forces of division, that are not just related to global politics and the global world stage. But how do we really understand the intensity of this feeling and how this has really been heightened over the last year, where certainly politicians are stepping in, but it's really about divisive opinions on lots of different topics, not just around politics. And we see this reflected in the sense that, a lot of people are understanding, a lot of Americans are understanding more and more that there's this higher level of conflict, even between their family and relatives, that, it certainly makes getting together for the holidays and for family gatherings tricky. But it's a growing sense that there's this kind of disagreement happening in more places than normal. And we see that reflected in the sense that people feel, that having differences in income and wealth is bad for society. And at the same time, that brands have an opportunity to step in and to address that inequality and to think about building a bridge between those. And I think the story here about splintered societies is about kind of two ways of navigating this. One is about trying to kind of bring attention to inequality and bring attention to some of these difficult topics by leaning into a particular cause, as is the example here with financial inclusion, the first and third examples actually. But the other way to navigate it is to think about, breaking down boundaries and starting to bridge divisions by promoting understanding, as this example of bringing more attention to the reality of refugees. Immigration is certainly one of the hot button topics that we're seeing in many countries, including the US. And that's one of the ways that brands and organizations have started to lean in, is to try and bridge those divides and promote greater understanding. So as we think about what this means, this idea of splintered societies means for OEMs, one of the things that we're looking at from a market perspective is that this kind of division is highlighting the importance of understanding all the diverse perspectives of your buyers. How can you really understand how to engage with some more deeply? They may have much deeper and harder stances on some of those hot button issues. But how do you start to think about, to that point of the brand examples on the prior page, bridging a more unified community? Is there an idea of, if we're all drivers on the same roads, we're all navigating the same challenges and literal obstacles in the road, how does that potentially translate to mutual understanding? Can we come to some kind of a common ground? And then thinking too about the citizen perspective and consumers, how do we think about cultural moments and feelings that can unite us? So are there cultural things that we can agree on? Are there events, tentpole events, things that generally people feel good about that provide that kind of much needed common ground? And how can we think about that specifically as an industry and as brands? Is there a sense of a communal badge of unity that can be expanded beyond the Jeep Wave, or beyond a specific OEM brand? How can that potentially help bridge that divide and help people come together in a way that is perhaps feeling unusual in a splintered society? The third trend is around, the macro environment of the climate, and we're certainly see this changing over the long term, in the sense that in the past 10 to 12 years that we've been studying attitudes on this, we have definitely seen an increase in people agreeing that, this is an area of concern, and a much bigger sense of consensus over the past decade that climate change is a problem that we need to address. But what we're seeing evolve over the past year has been financial concerns, the impact of an uncertain economy, and really an argument that's developing around who's responsible and what is getting in the way of true action on climate change and on the environment. So we see this reflected in the sense that, more and more people agree that we're heading for environmental disaster. And this is up considerably from when we started asking it more than 10 years ago. And at the same time, we've also seen a larger percentage of Americans say they're already doing all they can to save the environment. So there's a little bit of a, kind of a balance between, yes, this is a problem, versus, hey, it's not necessarily my personal responsibility or my responsibility alone. So that is a big shift in terms of attitudes that we've seen that change over time. And that's reflected in how people are engaging with brands and what brands are doing to address this. So there's certainly a lot of categories that are thinking about sustainability differently. And a lot of categories and brands that we're talking with are really thinking about co-packaging it benefits. So thinking about, yes, sustainability is core to our offering, but is not necessarily the thing that we're going to lead with in terms of talking about the benefits to the consumers. It might be that we're packaging that together with premium, or it might be that we're packaging that together with aesthetics and design. So it's really something that brands are starting to navigate differently over the past couple of years in particular. They're not necessarily walking away from their commitments to ESG, but they are changing how they talk about it, and they're changing to essentially acknowledge the systemic changes and really, I think meet consumers where they are, that economics are more important, the cost of goods are more important, that people have other concerns and other things that they're dealing with that may trump sustainability in terms of, what's highest on their list when they're making a purchase decision. And we think the same thing is certainly true in automotive in the sense that, when we're looking at the market impact, there is a distinction between, what people are expecting the industry to do, policymakers to do, versus what they're doing themselves. And we see that reflected in the sense that, a lot of the electrification is still driven by governments and businesses and certainly the infrastructure that's needed to support that. But it also, I think, harkens back to that point about co-packaging sustainability benefits with things like efficiency, with premiumization, to really help nudge consumer behavior in the right direction. So that's really, I think, the thought started here about, how do you message it? How do you co-package benefits around sustainability with things like efficiency to move people in the right direction and to kind of align with where we're seeing other markets go as well. And then from a consumer perspective, really kind of looming in and understanding where there's tie-ins to the other trends, because I think that is also some of the magic of how to leverage these within your organizations, is to think about the combination of trends. So for example, if we're thinking about, a lot more uncertainty around climate disasters, then how can that be combined with things like really thinking about the planning and the resiliency? So is there an understanding to, really look at your vehicle as potentially a survival pod? Can you think about other benefits that kind of help people navigate the other aspects of this trend and help them understand, where there are different benefits that can be brought to the forefront? So really thinking differently about, all of the different aspects of the trends that people are faced with, not just when they're making the purchase decision, but all of the other ways that this impacts their lives. So lots of things to think about there. And as I mentioned, there's certainly a lot of crossover between the trends, and I think between climate change and technology is certainly a big one. We've all seen headlines around the impact of AI data centers and infrastructure on technology and how that is impacting climate change as well. So I think that's really a rich area that we won't go too much into depth here, but really an interesting way for you to think about using the trends as well as to kind of cross-pollinate them and think about how they work in concert. And the idea about technology is, and this has really changed over the past year or two, I would say, that we're in this kind of realm of techno wonder. On the one hand, we certainly see that there's positivity and hope for what technology can do, but at the same time, we're seeing a lot of worry, and not just about the climate impact of AI, but about the real impact on humans, on careers, and the impact of technology writ large, not just AI. So there's a lot of questioning about the role of modern technology in our lives. And we see that reflected in the sense that, generally our relationship with technology is improving. We see that most people think that technology can help us solve future problems, these big thorny issues that the society needs to deal with. But at the same time, there's a lot of kind of thinking about, how do we really understand the impact of technology? And we think about, the impact of AI really being kind of challenging in terms of what that looks like. And so Americans in particular are a little bit more kind of reticent around AI and a little bit more worried about the impact of AI, not just from an economic standpoint, but from an overall standpoint, a lot less trust in that aspect of technology. So we really do think that, it's this push and pull of, on the one hand, we value technology as consumers and we appreciate what it can do. We have hope for the future. We certainly have fun with AI at times as well. But there's this recognition and this growing worry that, technology, AI being one of them, is potentially having a negative impact. And we see this reflected in things like brands helping people unplug, but we also see it in terms of policy, for example, around questioning and potentially legislating the use of social media by teens and by children. So it's a bigger conversation that's been happening and growing over the past few years, particularly in the US, not just from a kind of social fear standpoint, although there is some element of that in terms of how you can be tracked, but more of a personal impact statement of, how is technology changing my life, changing the way that I interact with other people, for example. So it's something for us to think about, certainly because that kind of tension, that push and pull is something that consumers are grappling with. And I think that kind of tension is something we need to keep in mind in terms of how we're integrating technology into the vehicle, that it needs to kind of balance that push and pull that consumers are feeling. That on the one hand, integrating AI, amazing. We're talking to clients yesterday, in fact, about, is there a future where, your car is anticipating that you're on the way home from work and suggests that you order takeout because you typically do it this time and that day of the week. And you can just approve it by a voice command. So I think there's hope for that kind of hands-off and seamless, do it for me kind of technology. But at the same time, I think we have to be careful about where public opinion stands, because there is still some kind of desire to disconnect and desire to turn technology off. And so how do we think about serving both ends of that spectrum, which, by the way, may be the same person on different days or depending on kind of where their concerns lie. So how do you think about technology that fosters that connectivity, but then also allows, a little bit of room for almost backlash? So is there a way to shut off all of the technology that you feel is invasive or that you're worried about? How do you make the car more of a sanctuary? And that's really where we were going with this idea of consumers, although we, again, need it, appreciate it. I can't get anywhere without Google Maps right now. There's also this kind of push and pull in the usage of brands and in the usage of vehicles specifically. So how do you offer more transparency, more options to turn different features on and off? How do you give people a little bit more control over privacy settings that would appeal to people who are, more skeptical or more kind of weary of technology and about data privacy? And is there a way to think about, choosing a quote unquote analog vehicle or an analog mode to escape not just data harvesting, but also to think about what are those skills that we may have lost? In my case, the ability to navigate. Could you turn off those features? And is there a way for you to kind of go back to the pre-technology era? So it's an interesting challenge to think about, like the push and pull that people may feel within themselves, different buyers, but also on different days. So that really kind of is the first half of our trends, and the second half gets a little bit more in depth around, some of the kind of nuances that have come out over the past couple of years. And conscientious health, I think, is a big one, and this has changed pretty radically in the U.S. over the past year, in the sense that, there's been a big cultural shift toward more kind of medical interventions, and GLP-1s have been a big part of that. But it's something that we're starting to see shift culture, in the sense that, 2 to 3 years ago, I would say there was a real kind of holistic understanding of health, and part of that is retained, but it's shifted more towards interventions and physical health. And we're starting to see that really come to the forefront, in the sense that people want more control over their health, but they're also taking that control into their own hands. And a lot of Americans saying, look, I really am taking my own journey and looking for my own health information rather than relying on experts or relying on doctors. So it is about kind of taking that control back and doing what you think is right, which we certainly see reflected in the way that people are seeking care differently and looking for new platforms. So it's something that we see reflected in the sense that people definitely think that they want to improve their physical health, but at the same time, there's still this sense of improving your holistic health, your mental, emotional, and even social health. So we see that reflected in the sense that brands are really trying to lean into this, but they're also trying to help consumers navigate this new idea of health that's not just about performance and health and wearable technology, but it's also about, where are there potentially new interventions that can either help me from a physical health standpoint, like GLP-1, but also help me disconnect and help me really kind of slow down and reduce stress levels and get more rest. So that has really changed over the past couple of years of this idea of slowing down and really recognizing sleep and rest as something that's critical to health is a big change, I think, in particular for the US. And it's something that we think about too in terms of the implications for product design, for interfaces. And, one of the things that we're thinking about here in terms of the market impact is, in particular, going back to that earlier comment about the population of the US becoming older, how does that potentially impact what consumers are looking for in their vehicles? Is it something that, older consumers are looking for more accessibility features or to cater to well-being differently? How can we think about mobility for older drivers? So it is about physical health, but it's also about thinking of how those physical health needs and mental health needs may change as people get older with an aging population. At the same time, looking a little bit closer at consumers, we certainly see that element of wanting more control over your health. But how do you bring that idea of more control and this unplugging and de-stressing? Could there be something like a mental health mode that helps to monitor and mitigate stress levels when you're driving? Certainly something that I can use driving in New York City. But really thinking about new creative ways to think about advocating for health and helping consumers manage their health from a mental and physical standpoint, even when they're on the road, even when they're in a stressful situation, are there ways or modes or features that vehicles could potentially bring to the forefront? So the next trend, I think, is kind of a reaction to a lot of the macro forces that we were talking about at the beginning. And, I think this caused a bit of a stir when we started telling clients about it because I think it's a little bit negative on the face of it, in the sense that it's this kind of reaction, this nihilistic reaction of, there's so much going on in the world that's bad or that feels out of control. Why plan for the future? It doesn't matter. And I think there is an element, certainly, of that kind of disappointment and frustration with the status quo. Part of it is feeling unsupported, but part of it is also, kind of reacting to the reality of the uncertainty in that uncertain decade that we're living in. So it's not necessarily always bad. I think the other kind of way to look at this is that, people are looking for a sense of escape and thinking about, what is really important to them in terms of priorities. And a lot of this is reflected in what we're seeing in consumer sentiment around living for today. And part of that is because they feel like the future is uncertain. And that's, I think natural given the environment that we've been talking about in terms of what's happening in the world and all of that uncertainty. But at the same time, there can be a positive side of it of thinking, it's important to enjoy life today. And it's important for me to, not worry about tomorrow and it'll take care of itself. So it's something to think about, in terms of how we can activate on that. And I think there are some good examples of finding the balance between living for today versus planning for tomorrow. And, I think there's benefits to looking at both of that. Some of the things that we've been seeing is certainly a balance that even younger consumers around the world are balancing today, saving for tomorrow, but also spending more today. So it's less of a kind of delayed gratification and, wait and save for retirement and we'll have more fun there. I think people, especially having gone through the pandemic, realize that life is short and that life is precious. So they're taking a little bit more freedom with what's happening today, having more enjoyment, spending a little bit more, but not necessarily always to the extent of, to the detriment of your future. So I think that kind of balance of how do you enjoy life today, throw a little bit of caution to the wind. It's almost the kind of YOLO 2.0, as we like to think of it, without necessarily impacting your future in a negative way. And this certainly has an impact in terms of markets. If we're thinking about, wanting to live in the moment and spending patterns that really kind of represent that opportunity of living for today, of spending on experiences, that certainly helps things like vacations, socializing, going out for drinks and dinner, clothing, beauty, everything that is consumable and is really kind of short term today, does that potentially have a negative impact on these bigger ticket items like cars, houses, planning for the future, planning for retirement? Perhaps. And I think that's an interesting way to think about how do we reposition the car as the enabler of escape and freedom? Knowing that it has a longer term commitment and longer term financing is more the norm. How do you still kind of capture that sentiment of it can give you that freedom, it can give you that enjoyment today, despite the fact that it is a longer term commitment? And that kind of ties into this sense of, traditional milestones that we're seeing in consumers. And, if houses feel out of reach for many, which is certainly true in the US in terms of the housing market and prices, how do we help consumers navigate that kind of sense of wanting to prioritize immediate experiences and pleasure right now, today? Is there actually a way to capitalize on that? Because, if you're not saving for a house, frankly, you may be able to kind of live for the now through a more expensive model, or, something that you might not have spent that much money on upgrades. But it's that immediate gratification of getting a new car and getting the upgrades that you want. So kind of looking at the situation in both ways of, saving for the future and investing and making the right choices, but also having a little bit of fun and kind of leaning into that sense of throwing caution to the wind. The next one I think is particularly interesting for automotive and for American brands, because this is something that we're seeing really come to the forefront in terms of younger generations. And this idea of retreating to old systems is certainly reflected in things like the traditionalism of nostalgia, but it's much more than that. And I think it's deeper rooted. The image here references the trad wife trend. But I think the flip side of that is the manosphere and this kind of pull toward wanting things to go back to the way that they were. And the challenge with that, of course, is that, we see a lot of desire for wanting things to go back to the way it used to be. But at the same time, I think there's this recognition, a growing recognition, that the way that it used to be wasn't good for everyone. So there's the caveat there of, on the one hand, there are some things that are positive about the past, but it certainly wasn't the true for everyone. And I think we're starting to see that gender divide in terms of attitudes towards where we should be going, and what kind of progressive ideals are good versus bad. And more of a divide actually between younger generations, Gen Z in particular, starting to divide between more traditional on young men and then more progressive ideals on young women. The certainly have the impact of, the Trump administration and the rhetoric in terms of politics is having an impact on that, as is media. I mentioned the manosphere, and I think that's a big part of it. But it's also having a real impact on, policy changes, how people are navigating this, and how brands are navigating this as well. And so as we think about how this has an impact specifically on automotive, from a market standpoint, if the growing majority of the public wants the country to be the way it used to be, there's certainly an opportunity for brands to leverage nostalgic designs to build those kind of emotional bridges to the past. But I think the watch out here is that, we need to be careful not to alienate the more progressive segments of our market, and then think about how are you potentially bridging both at the same time. So is there the same branded body style that can appeal to traditionalists as well as more progressive, kind of norm breaking moms that are ferrying kids around? Are they both buying the same truck potentially? So how do you think about that lineup of bridging between traditionalist and more progressive ideals? And is there a solution that actually bridges both? At the same time, thinking about the impact on consumers and what they're yearning for, this kind of idea of simpler times, or this nostalgia of a simpler past, may lead drivers back to familiar brand legacies and more kind of tactile interfaces, versus more futuristic ones. So thinking about what is the balance of that interface in the car, how does that really parlay into this idea of, the role of the car, the role of your role in the car, and how that harkens back to the past or not. But I think that idea of looking at, the role of the car and how that is shaped by the body style that you choose, how that really kind of fits into your lifestyle and how you think of yourself as either shaking off norms and kind of moving forward and being more progressive or out of the box, versus being more traditionalist and retreating to what you know works well. Really kind of different, very different aspects in terms of the vehicle interface and the vehicle body style. So the last couple of trends I think are really important for all brands to think about, but particularly in terms of automotive. One, in terms of trust, and this is really critical for all brands to think about because it's changed so much in the past 10 years. And we're not the only market research firm and consulting agency to talk about this, but we have been studying it for a long time, and it's been a wholesale decline in trust. But certainly you've seen that from other agencies as well, that people are less convinced of the expertise of experts, of scientists. They're much less trusting of institutions than they have been in past years, and they're really distrustful of governments in particular. So it's a wholesale changing and decline of trust. But the positive side of that is that people are trusting individuals more. And so they're not necessarily, it's not just a displacement of trust or a reduction of trust, it's placing trust elsewhere. So we're really seeing that reflected in terms of people wanting to have brands that reflect their personal values, brands that they trust. But at the same time, we're starting to see some impact on brand loyalty, and really kind of seeing brands as an extension of themselves and expecting brands to be able to not just make money and, of course, be successful, but also to support the causes that I believe in. So there's very much a tie-in here to values and what you value as a consumer being really important. But I think the other element of that is it doesn't necessarily have to be relating to the brand itself. It could be relating to an individual who vouches for that brand. So we have a couple of examples here about brands who are really leaning into influencers and to individuals. But I think it's important to note that individuals could mean many different things. It could be certainly an influencer on social media, but it could be a collection of reviewers. What do people say about this particular year, make, and model? How are people reviewing this? What does my friend and neighbor say? So it's certainly this movement of trust from the institution and from business leaders, frankly, all the way down to the individual. So interesting to think about in terms of how do we shift our role of influence from the brand to the individuals? What are all the levers that we can pull in shifting that realm of trust more to the individual and to smaller groups? And I think part of this is driven by, living in an era of misinformation, that brands have really kind of shifted to become more of an extension of a consumer's worldview and their personal values. So it's something that people really feel tied to, but it's critical certainly for automakers to really think about how are we part of the solution in terms of transparency, and how do we kind of push back against that sense of the system is broken and that lack of trust in institutions. And I think here in particular, we were thinking about, quality is really the core component of that, and that issues around quality will certainly erode brand trust in the short term and the long term. So how do you think about being prepared to weather the storm? There may be recalls, there may be missteps, but how do you repair that brand trust and instill enough of it to be able to weather that storm when it happens, if it happens? And then from a consumer standpoint, what we've been thinking about a lot is, if a lot of brands are choosing, a lot of consumers, excuse me, are choosing brands that reflect their personal values, and they tend to trust new models more if it's from the parent brand that they know and that they trust. How do you recognize that, yes, there's an element of continuity in that, but at the same time, that trust is fragile, that, if there are issues with service or if there are significant issues that they experience on the journey, can that potentially still increase the risk of things like boycotts or permanent loss of loyalty, which, certainly we see that a lot more often in things like CPG, where it's a lot easier to switch your soda brand or your food brand than it is to switch your car. but certainly something that we're thinking about longer term, in terms of, could you change over your lease if you're unhappy with a particular brand? And I think there's this growing recognition that, as so many brands, there are so many brands to choose from, that consumers can still vote with their wallet. And do they really like the values that you present as a brand? I think is the core question here about how can we instill more trust as we're thinking about the connection with our consumers, deeply understanding what they value and making sure that we're connecting that through our communications back to what they really expect from us. The last trend is around, I think that maybe the most positive trend is around this idea of escape to individualism. And this has really evolved in the past couple of years to showcase how much, especially Americans, are taking their futures into their own hands and really expecting much more autonomy. And we're seeing a lot of this as a response, again, a different response to the same kind of macro environment where, people are looking at the uncertainty and looking at the systemic nature of things like home ownership or the cost of education, thinking about, what do I want from my life in terms of success? Does it have to look like generations before me? Does it have to look like my parents or my peers? And kind of pushing back on the boundaries and the limitations and expectations that are set by society. So they're really kind of looking at this environment of things that feel out of control and trying to take control back into their own hands and focus on their own success, their own choices, in some cases making very different choices about what that definition of success and what their life is going to look like. And so we see this certainly reflected in this wholesale kind of changing of the attitudes and changing of the guard about how important work and career is versus, the rest of your life. And this large proportion of the population thinking that it's more important to find that balance than to just have a successful career. So this is a significant change in terms of how we think about it, especially given the American culture of, the Protestant work ethic and the kind of sense of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and the promise of being able to remake yourself is so central to our cultural fabric that this is a really big attitudinal shift in terms of what people value and how they're focused on productivity versus happiness and kind of finding the balance in between. And we certainly see that reflected as well in the sense that, people feel more and more that how, it's up to you to figure out what your own decisions are and what kind of principles guide those decisions. And we're seeing that in particular reflected in lifestyle choices. We saw, the big study last fall and last summer was around conscious unbossing. But that's just one element of this broader rejection of careerism, the sense that, especially in younger generations, that they're not necessarily as devoted to a career as older generations are, which, I'm sure all of us can relate to managing multiple generations in our offices. But it's really this wholesale changing of, looking at what matters to you, how are you spending your time, and certainly reflected in things like people choosing not to have children, and really celebrating that as a lifestyle flex. So it's this broad changing of, how do we define success as a society? How do you potentially change that for yourself as an individual? And how does that in turn really change the way that you think about your purchases, your spending, what you invest your time in? So it's really a big change in terms of more freedom, more flexibility, and more control over what you see as your own path towards success. So certainly big implications here in terms of the automotive market. And, we're starting to see this kind of harkening back to that idea of trust, really kind of thinking about the impact of, where people are looking for information, how they're kind of defining what that path should be like. So the same way that they're thinking about a different path and not necessarily following the traditional path, we're seeing the same thing in terms of journeys. So how do we really think about the opportunity there of, not necessarily buying cars the same way that your parents would have or that anyone else would have? How do we really think about that in a world that has changed and that journeys are changing? And that's partly tied to this idea of, people being very kind of overwhelmed by choice. There's so much information out there. There's so much you could look into. They're starting to kind of push back on that and then look for, what really fits my needs. And certainly, I think there's, some interesting things coming through now around the configuration process. How does that really help people customize to make something feel super unique and really personalized? Can that whole process of vehicle configuration really be a reflection of their self-expression? So how do you allow buyers to really get the exact features that they want and frame it in such a way that it helps to serve this bigger purpose of, choosing your own path and choosing your own definitions of success, which may not look like anyone else's choices, but still gives them that flexibility. So really, hopefully, interesting inspiration for what you can kind of do with these and the impact to the industry. Before we go on to Q&A, just a couple of things to leave you with to think about. Certainly, you can download the full report that's available on our website. But I would also encourage you to reach out to our team because there's a lot more beyond the public report that we can dive into, not just the macro forces that we talked about, but a lot more data and a lot more insights that we can share with you, as well as a portal that we can talk about granting access to. And really kind of thinking about how you're using this within your teams. And this, if you attended our session last year, is similar. And I think something that we talk to all of our clients about is really thinking about how do you build this into your innovation process and into your long-term strategy? Can you give elements like this or ask us to help you really kind of infuse this into your planning process to really deeply understand how consumer attitudes and values and trends are driving new needs, new expectations? Can you dive a little bit deeper? And we can certainly help with that in terms of customizing the trends. So these were all built to relate to any market. As you can imagine, they're not necessarily super customized to automotive, but they could be. And a lot of our clients use them as input into briefs. So taking these and saying, hey, if we're thinking about this campaign, this particular trend is really interesting. Can you infuse that into how you're thinking about the consumer attitudes? And certainly a lot of agencies use those as insights and inputs and inspiration as well. And then lastly, thinking about those macro forces that we were talking about. We've done a lot of work with clients over the past couple of years to infuse that into all of their insights. So literally plugging them into other types of market research to be able to help future proof and make sure you're looking for those sharp edges of changing attitudes and expectations. So really using all of these as tools in your toolkit to be able to sharpen your view of the future consumer and what they're going to need and expect from you as a brand and from you as an industry. So lots of tools at your disposal. We're certainly happy to answer questions now live, but we can also follow up with people if they have deeper questions as well.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, and I'll reiterate the Q&A is open now if you have not gotten your questions in and you'd like to. We are going to go through as many as we can, but at some point, if we do not get to your question, we can always follow up via email at a later date. Jennifer, I want to start off with one that's about AI, because I think this kind of touches on a few of the different trends that you were talking about, but also something that's just obviously in the news a lot. This person's asking, what impact will AI agents have on the car buying process?
Yeah, I think that's a big question, and it's something that all of our clients, in fact, I think we've spoken to probably 4 different industries and a dozen different clients over the past week about that. Agentic commerce is definitely here. And, I think on the face of it, you might say, well, I'm never going to ask Chat GPT to buy a car for me. But I think that would be a mistake not to look into it and not to think about what does the purchase journey look like in the area of agentic commerce. And really that's changing very rapidly. If you look at what Google is doing right now, for example, on changing the way that their AI mode results are bringing in more sponsored results. It's a big shift in terms of we've all been working on SEO and SEM and advertising and branding and shifting all of that journey into an AI platform, whether it's hosted on Google or not, is a big change in terms of the way that people look for information and who they trust. So that is going to evolve very quickly as, for example, Google builds in more sponsored results into their AI results. We certainly expect other platforms to do the same. That is going to have an impact on trust. Do people trust the AI results? Are they looking for that kind of hand-holding through the process? Are they looking for recommendations? How is that potentially going to change as sponsored results come into the mix? So it's a big question mark. And I think we're working through a lot of scenario planning with clients right now because it's also wildly different for different categories in terms of how brands are leaning into it, how much consumers are actually taking action versus just looking for information. But expect it to evolve rapidly over the next 6 months to a year.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add to that. The other piece of AI to me is the fact that it can just be an aggregator, right? Because a lot of what we see with the purchase process right now, the dealership is still definitely up there as an important source of information, but there's a much more diverse set of sources, whether it's the third-party sources, web videos, social media, and having AI as the tool to distill all of that information is not only are you using AI to make the recommendation, but at least just to see what all of those types of sources are saying is another hurdle to make sure that your voice is getting heard if you're a marketer, or your vehicle is actually coming out on top when it comes to the prompts that people are putting out there. So it's definitely going to change things.
Yeah, I think couldn't agree with that more. And I think that's really the concern in terms of the impact. And I'll actually stop sharing my screen so you can see us a little bit better. I think that aggregator piece is critical, and that's kind of what I was getting at too in terms of the impact of where is information coming from. There's a lack of transparency in terms of how models are sourcing that. But what brands are doing and what we're helping brands do within Ipsos right now is exactly what you said, is trying to figure out how do you optimize all of your information, all of your channels, especially your online channels, to be able to come to the top of those recommendations and make sure that you're getting surfaced and that you're part of the feed. Because I think the watch out is if you're not optimizing for Gen AI and LLMs right now, you're going to be left behind because other brands are doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a little bit connected question because you were just talking about, brands kind of floating to the top. Does brand matter as more goods, even these big ticket items like cars, are becoming more price sensitive and commoditized?
It's a great question. And I mean, I would love to hear your perspective on it as well. So maybe I can start and you can jump in. I
Sure.
think it certainly does on things like bigger ticket items more so, and kind of back to the point that I was making earlier, that it's a lot easier. Just the switching cost is much lower for something like, a CPG, switching your shampoo or your soda brand or what have you is certainly much easier. I think there's a lesson to be learned from financial institutions, in fact. So thinking about the importance of brand, even if you're upset with, for example, say you're working with Citigroup or Wells Fargo or bank, any financial institution, and there's something that you disagree with, it's a lot harder to switch, of course, because you're not going to go change all of your accounts. So you may be unhappy with a brand or a stance that they're taking or not taking. I think the same thing applies to things like, automotive. You're not going to change your loyalty overnight, but I think it does still matter, absolutely, in terms of people having a very real connection to that brand and a deep historical loyalty. I know in our family, I won't name any names, but there's deep, deep loyalty into specific automakers and specific brands that have been trusted for decades. So I think it's a lot harder to disrupt that trust. But, given that people are, certainly able to switch their leases, looking at other automakers coming in, perhaps that trust is changing. But would love to hear your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think there's two sides of the same coin. On one end, you've got loyalty and conquest is a big piece of the industry. And like you said, especially with big ticket items, I think that there's a need of making sure that you don't have regret. So aligning a brand that you can trust and go towards. And I think that there are certain, maybe not even brands, but also certain models that you necessarily gravitate to if you are, a minivan person, or you are a rugged SUV person, or you are an EV person.
Mhm.
But the other piece of it is that there are lots of segments within the industry that are just kind of bloated and starting to all find common ground, and it becomes much harder to differentiate. And in some cases, they're not really differentiating. They're all kind of the same compact SUV or midsize SUV. And how do you differentiate from that? Um, so it depends on what you're looking for in your vehicle, whether it's a basic transportation or something that is, personalized and stylized to you and your lifestyle and who you want to be. Um, it becomes a much more personal decision, which is a different trend that you were talking about entirely. But I still think brand has the upper hand from that name recognition. It might not be a reputation thing per se, but it definitely is a connection.
Well, actually, I thought that's where you were going to go was in terms of reputation, because I think that's where brand actually does make a big difference. And also goes back to that trust element of, if you're seeing a lot of positive reviews from different peer, I don't want to say peer review, but consumer reviews, aggregator sites, that does have an impact on the brand. And I think that's how you get known for quality, get known for reliability. So I think in that sense of tying trust and quality and brand together, brand is hugely important in automotive.
It definitely is. It definitely is. Um, Especially when it comes to the kind of, I think we even talked about this last year, the idea of the splintering of, well, you've got mass market brands, you've got the premium brands, you've got the ones that are very specific towards EVs, even under the same, OEM, that can all kind of fit under the same umbrella of the general public. Here is another one talking about I guess, same idea, the moving away from rhetoric and actually searching out and buying US products. Is there anything that you're seeing in that regard that's new?
Yeah, I would say that that is definitely something that we've seen in the past year, but it's also been the exact opposite case in other markets. So we've seen it again more so in CPG goods and FMCG in the sense that people are frankly turning away from American brands outside of the US. Now, does that have an impact on brand purchase within the US? Not necessarily as much as you might think. So I think there are some political lines that I don't have the data at my fingertips, and we do a lot of political polling around that kind of a topic as well. But I think that it's not as strong of an indicator as you would expect in the US overall for any category. But I'm curious if you've seen something in your automotive data that would indicate a specific pull toward that in automotive.
Ironically, not automotive, but I've seen something in Ipsos Public Affairs where there has been a drop in the percentage of people that want a brand to remain neutral. So they definitely do want them to have an opinion, and of course they're trying to find these brands that do align with their values. But to your point, I think that there's a bit of a do say gap with a large population of people that maybe want to make sure that a voice is heard and then make a decision about whether or not they actually care. But they want to at least hear. They don't want the silence to trump over anything that is an actual statement that's public.
Yeah, I think that's right. That, there is a say do gap between being, potentially upset about a brand making a stand or not, versus does it ultimately impact your purchase decision? I think it's going to be wildly different depending on what category we're talking about.
Yep, yep, absolutely. Um, How do you see OEMs navigating this new trend of lower prices or less technical vehicles like that under 30,000 K market? We've seen it with some of the new entrants in the industry like Slate Auto, which is very modular and trying to become this very, very bare bones EV vehicle. How do you see them navigating that as price becomes that paramount concern?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really an area of innovation, and I hope that the industry is kind of taking notice of that. And it's something that we're seeing not just in automotive, by the way, but also in boating. So we just did a large study for the boating industry same thing that we've seen costs creep up over, the past few decades. And a lot of consumers are looking at these bigger purchases and saying, I just don't know if I can afford that. It's something that I certainly want and that's important to me, but it just doesn't fit my budget. So I think as we're seeing costs creep up overall for the average vehicle, the average boat as well. I would expect to see the same thing in RVs, any kind of large vehicular on land or water purchase. There's definitely going to be more demand at the lower end scale and at the more kind of affordable end of the spectrum. And again, that's a direct reflection of consumer confidence and what they're seeing in the economy. It's a reflection of, wages not necessarily keeping up with inflation, but I think it's been a long slog for consumers of experiencing the disruption of the pandemic and then ongoing inflation and rising consumer prices that I don't think is going to come down anytime soon. So I do hope to see more innovation and a lot more kind of variance in terms of those price points, but would love for your perspective on that as well.
Yeah. It's interesting because I keep seeing new car prices going up in the aggregate across the industry. And some of it is also a little bit of a gaming of the industry where you introduce a base trim for the first year so that you can say it starts below 30,000, but then you cut it off immediately. Or even some of the lower priced vehicles that were in the market just don't have that much interest, so they've fallen off. I think as of right now, the big trend that we're seeing is just longer loans. People really reaching for that, what's going to be my monthly payment, not really, hey, what's the price tag on this car?
Mhm.
And that shift in psychology has led to these high prices being sustainable, at least for the time being. How long that lasts, or how far can that stretch before all of a sudden you've got, loans beyond 100 months? I don't know. Um, but I do find it interesting that you would think that you would have these cost pressures when affordability is such a buzzword in society right now, that the big ticket item of a new car continues to stay at that 45 plus thousand mark as a medium price.
Yeah, and I would expect to have an impact on, how many people are just keeping their old car or not buying a second or third car. So I think there are other ways to look at that, and certainly we can dive in. But I know there were a bunch of great questions, so I want to make sure we get time for a couple more. And I know we don't want to keep people too long, but maybe two more questions.
Yeah, yeah, no, I got them right here. Um, the trends of vehicle as a sanctuary and that control of health that we talked about, does that apply to commercial fleet buyers as well? Do they feel a need to give greater consideration to the health of their drivers as commercial drivers?
That is an amazing question. I wish I had the answer to that. We do a lot of work in automotive and fleet. I don't think we have that particular attitude captured, but would love to dive into that. I can follow up separately on that because I know we've done some specific client work that may directionally give us some information on that. So
Mhm.
not on my fingertips right now, but I can certainly follow up on that. I would guess though that as we're seeing a bigger focus on employee well-being, employee retention, overall health, that I would see an increase in that. I don't know if you've seen anything in your data though.
No, in fact, this was a question. I wish it says here that's an anonymous attendee. I wish I knew who this was. So if you'd like, please reach out to us afterwards and say that was my question, because I'm also very curious. This is a bit of a blind spot for me in terms of how the fleet managers operate, but I know that we do have a lot of fleet management studies, or at least sample at our fingertips so that we could go and ask. So I do think that that's a question worth being intrigued about and worth answering.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I've got, I think, one more here. Uh, is it a large enough market of wealthy people emerging that brands can offer to focus on them versus just mainstream, and have that big ticket
Yeah,
item be something that's a bit more of a lofty goal?
that is a great question. So again, I wish I had it at my fingertips. Ipsos has an affluent study that I think we could actually answer that with, uh,
Hmm.
perhaps in combination with your automotive data, Graham. And I think that, as much as we wish that we could cover every single segment in depth, And I know there was another question about how this is fielded, so it kind of ties into that. The way that we field is typically a large sample within all of our markets, 43 markets in this wave. So unfortunately, because of the global nature of this syndicated study and this public element of the study, we can't get into too much depth in terms of income level. So we can get into a little bit of that, but again, because it's meant to cover every category as well, limitations in terms of how much question coverage we have around the category, like automotive. So I guess my answer is I think we actually have some data on that, but not in this study. So we can follow up with you on that as well.
Great. The only other piece I think I'd say to that is, in some cases, a lot of the automakers already are. I think that there's a bit of a difference sometimes between someone who wants a luxury vehicle, especially a maybe more opulent look at me vehicle, or one that has that same exact price point, but it looks more like a working car that has all the bells and whistles, or is more sport, right? There's a lot of different ways to segment to your consumer that is affluent, besides just the opulence of a luxury badge. So I don't think you're necessarily ignoring much of the population, but you are making sure that you're making everyone feel specially wealthy in their own way, to help advocate for that big ticket item, for sure.
Yeah, and I guess it goes back to what we were saying earlier too, in the sense that, if you're defining success pretty differently from some of your peers or prior generations, what would have seemed like, very only wealthy people would buy this level of car. Look, if you're in more of that nouveau nihilism, live for today kind of mindset, and you just are not focusing on the future, you're not worried about it, it may not mean that you're affluent. It may just mean that those are your priorities and that it's
Yeah.
important to you to have that particular make and model and that level of trim. So I think I wouldn't discount other buyers. I think that it's a lot more fluid than it used to be just in the last 5 years. That again, we're seeing the same thing in other big ticket items, that it definitely is not the case that you have to be affluent to be making these bigger purchase items. In fact, we've seen a lot of luxury spending, for example, very high-end jewelry, and very expensive clothing, shoes, for example, being purchased at much younger age levels than ever before. So people
Yeah.
are not waiting until they get the next promotion, they, move in and start a family. They're wanting those luxury items and those experiences now. They're not necessarily willing to wait.
Yeah, absolutely. And the only other piece I want to mention on that is, I think it's a bit more urban and suburban centric to say, well, you could probably maybe lop off a piece of that population, because the rural population needs a personal vehicle, just carte blanche to get to where they need to go, versus I think a lot of the urban population that might have a bit more money to spend is also the type of person that doesn't need to spend the money because they've got public transportation or other means of proximity to what they have around them. So
Yeah.
you can't necessarily ignore that population at all, because they're the ones, to your point, that put high value on a personal vehicle for that freedom and transportation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's wildly different for someone who's making the same amount of money in New York versus New York or San Francisco or anywhere that has, some big public transportation. That's going to be wildly different from someplace like, even I would say DC, where, it's a little bit more limited in terms of the subway lines, but wildly different from where, for example, my family is in Western Minnesota, where there's no other option. You need to have a car. So I think thinking about the consumer mindset in those kind of differences of like, look, I'm going to be spending an hour driving to and from work, 2 hours a day in this vehicle. I need to have it. Does that mean they spend more? Potentially, because they're spending a lot of time in it and it is a necessity. So I think, again, bringing that mindset of what is valuable to me today, what kind of
Yeah.
experience do I want to have, is certainly part of the kind of equation that consumers are going through and thinking through. But also recognizing that, I don't want to sugarcoat it. People are struggling. Consumers are struggling. They're worried about income. They're worried about making ends meet. So while there's certainly opportunity to capitalize on that kind of live for today moment, I don't want to gloss over the fact that people are struggling, and I think they are trying to kind of make ends meet however they can.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, listen, I think we could probably talk about this forever.
We could go
I
on
think
forever.
yeah, we've hit most of the questions. If we did not get to your question, we will be provided a list of all of those questions and who asked them. So we will be able to email you and reach out with our thoughts privately. But other than that, I just want to thank everyone for joining. I want to thank Jennifer for joining us and distilling all of that really high thought information into something that's really, really applicable to a lot of the different industries that are listening in today. But thank you again, everyone, for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and week.
Thanks, everyone.